Hello all my bookish friends out there in booktube land, and welcome to this exciting episode of Tristan and the Classics. It's quite short, but it's for those of you literature lovers who really want to explore and get to grips with literature at a deeper level, understanding how literature has formed over time. And in this video, we're taking a look at the 5 most influential works of literature on other literature. So, having said that, let's get stuck in, shall we? So to start with, we just need to identify what we mean by the most influential books in literature and why it's relevant, why it might be a very good interest to someone who wants to get into literature more fully. So when talking about the most influential, of course, that depends on what you're saying the influence is. If I was talking about the most influential cooking books ever, then these books wouldn't be on the list. When I say influential, these 5 books are most influential in the realm of literature, specifically literature in association with the arts. Books come from previous books. Ideas build from other ideas. Things that are particularly good get grabbed hold of by other people who develop them further out. And so the most influential books tend to come much further back. This list will focus primarily on books from the Western canon. And that's not because it's superior. It's because in the mad progress of one nation conquering another nation all over the globe, in the past centuries, the Anglo-American world power is the one that's influenced more of the modern day nations around the world than someone else. And in the future, that will change, no doubt, when some other power becomes the dominant power. Its culture will be passed into other realms. And so that's why these books are coming from the Western canon primarily. So, why do we want to be interested? Well, if you really want to follow the development of thought and get an understanding of why art has took the shape it has, where ideas have come from, why certain books have sprung forth, where one idea in the 19th century doesn't just appear out of the blue, it appears from something that came in the century before it, which came from something in the century before that, and there are certain fonts, sources, ground springs from which most of the artistic literature comes out of, and you can trace it back. And having a knowledge of those will give you a deeper basis to establish all the other things you read onto. And so, having said all that, let's have a look at the 5. The first most influential works on the literary arts we want to consider are the Iliad and the Odyssey by Homer. So, written what, 8th, 7th century BC? These Greek epic poems have influenced literature massively going forward. Grasped in the Iliad and its famous war outside the walls of Troy, so the Trojan War, and then followed by Odysseus's trip home, trying to get home 10 years it takes him, the Greeks introduced the idea of nobility, dignity, what it means to be a hero, a warrior, a man, what is societally proper, what's expected of someone. These things were captured very vividly by the Greeks, by Homer or whoever wrote it, and put into superb language, which is so vivid and rich that it struck right to the heart of people. This was very quickly picked up by the ancient Greeks and built upon. So you think of Achilles, for instance, who's in the Iliad. Aeschylus is going to write about him later on, and various others. Then you're going to get the Romans, like the Iliad, is going to be built off this collection of Greek tragedies and plays which have sprung a larger degree from these two. Of course, there's many, many works back there, but these two sit very central even in the Greek mind, the ancient Greek mind. And there is reference to these works all the way through history, because they establish heroes of certain types. You think of the difficulty of leadership that's signified by Agamemnon and the arbitrary and ruthless way he used it. You think of what it means to be a great demigod hero, the ultimate hero in Achilles. You think of what it means to be noble when you consider Hector. And what about Paris, who beautiful in form but somewhat timid on the battlefield? These ideas, the role of fate, the haphazard nature of things in life, the interference of the gods and their bickering, all of this is the ground bed for a lot of the psychology, the modern psychology that we see today. And that psychology has been built from those works upwards through other literature as it's expanded. So if you want to get to the ground spring of literature, have a read of the Iliad and the Odyssey. And the more familiar you get to be with it, the more allusions you'll pick up to it through literature, through time, all the way up until our days. Is it Circe has just been released as a modern book, but you've got Ulysses by James Joyce back in the early 20th century, Ulysses being the Latin name of Odysseus, which is going back to Homer. So that was number one, the Iliad and the Odyssey. The second most influential work on the list is without a doubt the most influential work on all of literature, especially in the Western canon, and it is the Bible. Now, this is not a video for people to get down below and argue about whether the Bible is God's word or it's not God's word or whatever. On a purely literary level, it is indisputable that it is massively influential. The psychology of people, the Western canon in particular, is imprinted by this book. And think of all the stories and the types of characters that come out of the Bible to form the basis for characters in literature going forward, where other writers begin to examine more closely a particular ideal. You have the story of the creation, Adam and Eve and the serpent in the garden. There's the flood account, which many nations had already got, but this now becomes the most famous. The picking of God's people, the Israelites, the 10 plagues, God's majesty over all the way through many a character, Abraham, Moses, Isaiah. We talk about people being a Jeremiah or a prophet of doom. Someone can be a Job, that is, they're an afflicted person. Similar, you could say, to the Greeks sometimes talking about those afflicted by the gods and not knowing what was going on. And of course, what's very interesting about something like the Bible is the account of Jesus Christ as the Son of God, the model to follow for the Christian character. And that's interesting when you look at literature, because now think we've got Achilles, Hector, Agamemnon, Odysseus, Nestor, all of those characters. The ideal of the hero, the idea of the martial character and the brave. But then you have quite a different character being held up now in Jesus, who is self-sacrificing, meek for the poor, lowly, promotes humility. That's going to play into literature. You've got and forming a very interesting blend through the arts and forming the psychology of whoever decides to build out of these categories. Can I just interrupt this video to give you a brief word from the sponsor of this video, which is you, the viewer. If you enjoy digging into literature and you appreciate videos like this and want to see more, and you'd like to support my little channel, then consider either going over to my Patreon community, where we discuss a classic book every month and you'll get access to exclusive videos, or you can give me a small £3 contribution on my Buy Me a Coffee page. The links to both are down below. I thank you for all your support. Now, let's get back to our list. The third book in our list that I would call one of the most influential on literature actually springs from the previous two, a case in point of how literature gives birth to other literature. And we're looking at Dante's Divine Comedy. That is Inferno, Purgatorio and Paradiso, the three major poems. What's so amazing about this book, why it's so influential, is because, of course, the church is very dominant at this point. We're talking the 15th century, and people are Christian, but we're around the beginning of the Renaissance and the use of the Greek inspiration is also in. Dante combines so much Greek mythology along with biblical theology and merges it on this journey, this guided journey of Dante himself through hell, up through Purgatorio, into the Empyrean, ultimately, where God himself resides. You know, is it the 8 spheres of heaven? And it's interesting that his guide is none other than the Roman poet Virgil, so harkening back to the old epics. We have the famous account, don't we, in Inferno, when Dante's going to enter hell, and it's "Abandon hope, all ye who enter here." This has gone down as a legendary line in literature. And through hell he goes. Is it the 7 circles? I think it might be. You start with limbo, and you move through various different vices like lust and greed and gluttony and violence towards people. Deception and fraud is in there. You even go and meet Satan at the lowest point, who hell is froze over at that point because Satan's wings constantly flapping makes the area cold. Then up through Purgatorio, which pretty much goes through the same kind of vices again. We're talking the 7 deadly sins, but this is more on a psychological level. The Inferno part, particularly mixed with many a character from the ancient Greek legends. And so, you know, from the Iliad and Odyssey, you could grow out to many others. The Odyssey, you know, you've got many a great character, you know, like the Cyclops is in there, of course. But these are merged by Dante with Christian theology. And then up through the 7 deadly sins psychologically, where you can release yourself from limbo, from purgatory, if you know how to turn around and do the opposite, the virtue rather than the vice. And then up through the spheres of heaven, which leans on the ancient Greeks again, as it follows the geocentric nature of the earth, the Aristotelian view, the Ptolemaic view of the orbits, and into God himself, along with his love of his life, Beatrice. So that influenced the mind of the medieval world unbelievably. It made things visual. You think of all the ideas you have when you think of the phrase hell or heaven or purgatory. When we talk about sin and virtue and the works we must perform to get, repentance or get our way bought out of it, Dante is probably the most visual of all of these and became embedded in the psyche of all of Europe, really. And one little thing that has to be said about the innovativeness or the greatness of his work is, of course, instead of writing it in Latin, which would have been the usual thing to do, Dante wrote it in the vulgar Italian, introducing the idea of these books coming into the native language. Of course, Chaucer around that time would do something of the same thing with the Canterbury Tales in the English language, but of course nowhere near as dramatic as Dante, because it takes the classical world and the theological world, these two great pillars that underpin the most noble intellectual life of the day, and brings them forward vividly for everyone to look at. So that was number 3, Dante's Divine Comedy. The 4th most influential work on our list to affect the art of literature significantly and stretching beyond the Western canon, really significantly changing things, is the works of Shakespeare, or are the works of Shakespeare, the complete works. Some obviously better than others, but as a whole corpus, Shakespeare captures a tremendous amount of the art of literature. From the springboard of Shakespeare bounces forth so many works of literature, because as Harold Bloom, in his review of Shakespeare's work, he entitled it The Invention of the Human. Shakespeare managed to capture in brilliant words and rhythms more than any of his contemporaries did about the human condition. Some may argue that his style was not as sophisticated or as accurate as Ben Jonson or Christopher Marlowe, but what he got, and what literature is really about, is capturing the character, the person, the motivations, the psychology, the virtues, the vices. He pulls so many allusions from the Bible, so many from classical literature, that you understand why knowing those previous ones would just add flavour to understanding what he's writing about. But from Shakespeare's plays, you know, for the English especially, it became part of the national mentality. The ideal of the heroic figure, the martial figure, takes on the more modern form at this point. When we think of romance and love in particular, the idea of a love between two people opposed by their families, it's Romeo and Juliet changed our concept of love in literature. Before that, it was mainly the Plutarchan sonnets. Now, Shakespeare, what we take for granted, Shakespeare has pinned up this wonderful story of Romeo and Juliet, which he pilfered, by the way, but presented it so well. He presented it in almost the perfect form of the 5-act drama and showed what was possible to do with language and poetry. There's so much that can be said about him. The 4 tragedies, the big 4 tragedies, Hamlet, Othello, Macbeth and King Lear, exploring as they do some of the greatest faults in the human makeup, and doing it so well that it inspires writer after writer after writer to get one little observation. I mean, there's about 1,000 observations just from Macbeth, but each author can get one and expand it into some other work, you know, whether it be envy or ambition or jealousy or arbitrariness, whatever it may be. These things are indecision for Hamlet. These things have become a part of who we are. Now, do you see how understanding the well springs of literature, when we read more modern works, we begin to see their influence. Authors themselves, when writing, often have a knowledge of these things in the past. And there is so much injected into the meaning of a work by an author who's deliberately taking snippets from these great works that went before them, that if we can recognize them, there is far more color and depth to a book that we're reading than we may imagine at first glance. The 5th and final work on this list of the most influential works of literature is Don Quixote by Cervantes. Don Quixote is not only a magnificent story, very entertaining, very funny, stays with you a long time and reveals more of itself to you every time you read through it. It is also a remarkable moment in literature. It's called the first modern novel. What Cervantes did in Don Quixote was really what seems obvious today. It seems a mind-bending decision. He breaks so many rules of literature in doing this. No longer does he represent a story as an account of history directly, but he actually engages in a contract with the reader, almost for the first time in history, where he says, I'm going to tell you something that is make-believe, but you are to believe it and respond to it as though it is real. He introduces a break and a revolt against the chivalric romances and the way people have tried to interpret love and life of that day, and turned it over to the mundane, to the crazy, to the bizarre illusions we build up for ourselves, which are actually absurd. And he asks us to begin to look maybe a little bit at the crazy, at the psychology of our own day-to-day existence. Thinking of Don Quixote when he tilts his famously tilts at windmills, which he conceives to be giants, but we know as the reader that they're windmills. What is that if not an overblown dream, an overblown vision of oneself, or the importance of one's life, or the hopes to make meaning in your own life? And of course, Cervantes came from quite a ripe background himself. There's a lot that could be said. Now, I'm not trying to go on and on about each individual book in this, but Cervantes grabbed hold of the primal nature of telling stories, which all cultures have had, and transferred it into a form which hadn't quite been done like that before. So effective was that form that it was picked up very quickly, and other writers had their world opened, because now they could approach different topics in a new way. No longer did it have to be a history. No longer did it have to have the confines of a play. This could allow you not just to judge a character by their words. You could now enter the mind of a character who you could tell you what they were thinking at the time. You know, this is quite revolutionary. And of course, that in itself makes this one of the most influential works for the whole world, because the tradition of novel writing really finds its birth in Cervantes' Don Quixote. So what did you think of those 5 massively influential books? Of course, you could make a case for other books to be influential. If I was talking about science, then, you know, Principia Mathematica by Newton is going to be on there. Euclid's Geometry will be on there. Darwin's Origin of the Species will be on. Of course, other books will be there. If you want to focus in on a particular part of the world, then definitely you'll get different books. But do you see how these 5 books specifically, they, as we've referred to them, are well springs. They go back quite a long way and have fed their way up, and other works have come out of them, like innumerable amounts of work. The value of this, if you want to have a greater appreciation of literature, is the more familiar you get with these fundamental works. And of course, you could add a bunch to them. It's not just these 5, lots of the Greek works and Latin works. But if you get familiar with those 5, their fingerprints are found all over other bits of literature. Okay, so the ancient Greeks will have stuff come out of the Iliad and the Odyssey. The great deal of first English and then European literature springs out of Shakespeare. Hands down, tons of stuff just pours out of the Bible. Imagery, reaction, understanding of the afterlife, so much of that, when you go to literature, has sprung out of Dante and his very vivid way of perceiving the underworld and heaven itself. So the more we get to know those core ideas and recognize them, the richer our reading becomes of later works. Because especially in the classics, the classic writers may have had classical educations. And so they know these characters from the past and often make reference to them almost as a shorthand for how to approach their work or how to consider a particular character. It means their characters, when arriving on a page, don't come with no history. They're actually infused with the qualities and histories and psychology of the works that came before. And that adds so much to your appreciation of what's being written. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. It's supposed to be short and diverting and by no means exhaustive. And leave me your comments down below which ones you would add to this list or which ones you particularly enjoy out of this. And until the next time, I wish you joy in whatever you read.